He heard a faint sound coming from the locked room. Reed stopped. His instincts told him to knock, but no one answered. He pressed his ear against the door. There was a rustling noise inside, followed by a hoarse, trembling voice. "Please open the door." "I beg you." Reed kicked the wooden latch. The door flew open, and the stench of mildew and sweat hit him in the face. In the middle of the dark room, a tall, muscular Apache woman was tied to a post, her clothes in tatters. Her black eyes burned as they locked onto his. "Please take me with you," she gasped. "I will bear your child. Just save me." Reed stood still for a moment. Images of his lost wife and child flashed through his mind, how they had once pleaded for help, and he had been powerless to save them. He pulled out his knife and cut the ropes. "Let's go!" Shouts echoed from the hallway. Reed pulled her toward the back door, running across the yard of red dust. They jumped into the wagon as gunshots rang out behind them. Reed cracked the whip, the wheels screeching over the dirt road. The small town faded behind them, but the yelling still carried in the wind. In the wagon bed, the woman lay panting, her hands still trembling, yet her eyes no longer held despair. Now they blazed like embers. Evening fell, and the desert turned red under the spreading Sunday. Reed pulled on the reins as the wagon turned into a narrow canyon. He knew the men chasing them would not risk riding hard in the dark. "Get down," Reed said, pulling the brake. Takina looked at him briefly, then quietly stepped off the wagon. She still clutched the rusty knife, standing tall. The muscles in her arms taut and veined. Reed tied the horse and built a small fire from dry branches. He silently unscrewed his canteen and handed it to her. Tina drank in small sips, her eyes still watching him carefully. Like a young wolf, unsure if the human in front of her could be trusted, Reed looked at her through the firelight. "I do not need you to repay me, and I am not handing you back to them." She stayed silent for a moment, then sat down by the fire, keeping her distance. The red marks from the ropes were still visible on her wrists. Reed pulled a clean cloth from his pocket and held it out. She hesitated, but eventually extended her arm. Reed bandaged the wound slowly and gently. Tina held her breath, staring at his rough hands. When he was done, she gave him a slight nod, not a word of thanks, but her face had softened. Night fell. The sounds of insects and wind whispering through the canyon mixed with the soft crackle of fire. Reed leaned back against the wagon wheel, his rifle resting across his lap. Suddenly, the sound of horse hooves echoed from afar. Reed signaled for silence and used his boot to smother the fire. They both dropped flat to the ground. Takina's warm breath hit his arm. The hooves passed by the trail above, then faded into the distance. Once sure they were safe, Reed sat up and rekindled the fire. Tina remained still, but something in her gaze had shifted. Not entirely weary anymore, but touched with a hint of trust. "Get some sleep," Reed said, tossing her a thick coat. She pulled the coat over her shoulders, lying down on her side with her back to him, the knife still in her grip. Reed looked at her strong, broad back, then leaned against the wheel again, eyes open deep into the night. For the first time in years, the desert night did not feel so empty. On the third night, the sky suddenly broke open with rain. Desert rain was rare, but when it came, it poured in heavy sheets, pounding the cracked earth with thunderous force. Reed was covering the horse with a tarp when he heard a harsh, choking cough behind him. He turned and saw Takina curled up near the dying fire, sweat streaming down her face despite the cold air. She was shivering violently, and the old rope marks on her arm were swollen and inflamed. Reed knelt beside her, placing a hand on her forehead. It was burning hot. Without a word, he stoked the fire until it roared, boiled water, and heated his knife until it glowed. Then he sterilized the wound. "Hold still," Reed said, taking her hand. Tina clenched her jaw, the veins on her neck standing out. As the blade sliced into the swollen flesh, releasing pus and blood, she let out only a faint groan. Then fell silent. Reed cleaned the wound, wrapped it in dry cloth, his hands firm, but oddly gentle. When it was done, he pulled her closer to the fire. "Sit here, get warm." Tina sat down, the firelight casting shadows over the tense muscles of her shoulders and old scars. A long moment passed before she spoke, her voice rough and low. "I was taken from my village as a girl. They sold me from one camp to another. Every time I fought back, they beat me unconscious." Reed said nothing, his eyes fixed on the flames. "I had a younger sister," Takina continued, her eyes darkening. "They killed her right in front of me. That night I swore I would never let myself be tied down again. Silence followed. Only the steady drumming of rain echoed through the canyon. I lost everything too, Reed said, his voice as rough as wet stone. My wife died of fever. My son followed soon after. I stayed on the ranch and lived alone for years. The two of them sat across from each other, the firelight forming a bridge between two tormented souls. No promises were made, no touch exchanged, but a quiet trust began to take root. When the rain eased, Reed stood and laid a heavier blanket out for her. Get some sleep. We have to leave early tomorrow. Takina pulled the blanket over her shoulders and gave a slight nod. For the first time since she was taken, she slept deeply, no longer haunted by the shadows. Reed watched her for a long moment before returning to his seat. He leaned back, his rifle resting across his lap. The desert night was quiet, but this time it was not loneliness. It was a beginning. At dawn the next morning, the sky lit up red as the first light spilled over the valley. Reed stepped out early, walking along the row of wagons to inspect the area. On the sand, still wet from last night's rain, he suddenly spotted fresh hoofprints, deep and evenly spaced. They did not match his horses. These were from at least 3 others closely trailing in the same direction. Reed knelt down and touched the print. The earth was still damp. That meant they had passed by only a few hours earlier. Back at camp, he found Tina warming her hands by the fire, her face still pale with the lingering fever. They're tracking us, Reed said, voice low but certain. Tina gripped her spear tighter, her dark eyes narrowing. They will come back. Reed looked at her for a long moment. He could walk away. He could let her handle it herself, the way survivors often do. But he saw something in her eyes, something unbreakable. The same look he had when he stood at the grave of his wife and son, swearing never to bow again. If you want to keep running, I will help, Reed said. Tina did not answer right away. She got to her feet, striding over to the horse, carrying her spear and gear. I have run long enough. If they come, I will be waiting. Reed nodded. Then we get ready. They packed quickly and left the canyon before the sun rose too high. By midday, Reed brought Tina to his ranch, a weathered log house tucked deep within the grasslands. A cattle shed, a wooden fence, a water tank. Everything looked like it had just barely survived a long drought. As soon as they stepped through the gate, Reed got to work reinforcing everything. He added extra locks to the doors, boarded up the windows. Takina helped clear dry hay away from the house to prevent fire, stacking wood into neat piles. That evening they sat together on the porch. Reed cleaned his Winchester rifle with practiced care, while Ta sharpened her spear under the glow of a lantern. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was no longer a wall. It was an unspoken pact. When the storm came, they would stand together. In the distance, a dog's howl echoed from the direction of town. Reed glanced at Tina and saw her lift her head, eyes calm and steady. He knew then, if they did come, this would no longer be his fight alone. I truly appreciate your being here. If this story reminded you of old days, dusty evenings, and hoofbeats echoing in your heart, please subscribe to my channel so that each day we can sit together once more, and I will tell you another story from the West. The sun stood high overhead and the sunlight burned like needles against the skin. Reed pulled down his wide-brimmed hat, his calloused hands tightening around a length of rusted wire. The northern fence had been knocked down by winter winds, making it easy for the cattle to wander off. Takina walked up, carrying a full wooden post across her shoulder, as if it weighed nothing. Muscles flexed along her sun-darkened arms with every movement. She drove the post deep into the ground, sweat dripping from her brow with each powerful thrust. Reed glanced at her, slightly taken aback. This was no longer the fragile woman he had rescued from a dark room. This was a warrior through and through. "Watch your hands," he warned as the wire stretched taut. But it was Reed who slipped. The twisted wire snapped back, lashing across his wrist. Blood seeped from the fresh cut. Takina dropped what she was doing and took hold of his hand. Her skin was rough, warm, but the way she held him was precise and careful. She pulled him down to sit, tore a strip from her worn leather skirt, and wrapped the wound. Reed started to pull away, but the look in Tina's eyes kept him still. It was no longer guarded. It was something gentler, something rare. "You cannot do this alone," Takina said, her voice deep and warm. By evening, they herded the cattle back into the barn. Smoke from the log house curled into the sky, blending with the deep red of dusk. The cattle bellowed, dust swirling through the air. In the middle of the chaos, Reed and Tina moved as one, his voice calling, her whip cracking until the herd settled inside as if guided by a single rhythm. That night, they sat in front of the fireplace. The wood crackled softly, casting flickering light across their faces. Reed sat his Winchester down beside him and sat in silence for a long while. Tina sat across from him, her long black hair falling loose, the braid having come undone on her scarred, sun-darkened face. Her eyes shone with something both resolute and tender. Their eyes met. No more suspicion, no more hesitation, only silence, the kind so complete. Even the wind outside dared not intrude. Tina leaned in slightly. Reed did too. The kiss came naturally unrushed, unplanned, as if all the days behind them had been leading to this single moment. The scent of smoke, sweat, and earth mingled between them. No words were needed because trust had already been planted, and now it had begun to take root. The peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching hoof-beats from the main road. Reed was cutting hay when the old dog howled and bolted toward the gate. He squinted into the distance. 5 riders, wide-brimmed hats shadowing their faces, revolvers swinging at their hips, rode slowly toward the ranch. Takina appeared on the porch, spear in hand, her gaze sharp as a blade. Reed shook his head slightly, signaling her to stay back, then stepped into the yard with his Winchester in hand. The lead rider, a thick-bearded man, jerked his chin up. "We heard you're hiding an Apache girl. Hand her over and things stay peaceful." Reed stood tall, one hand steady on his rifle. "No one here is property you can demand." Another man spat into the dirt and sneered. "Don't be stupid, friend. We paid good money for her. If you don't give her up, this whole ranch goes up in flames." Reed raised his rifle. The barrel glinted under the Sunday. "You cross that gate, and not one of you walks away whole." The air turned heavy. The dog growled low. Wind stirred the red dust. The 5 men glanced at each other, then turned their horses. But before they rode off, the bearded one looked back, voice full of threat. "We'll be back, and next time it won't be just 5. As the hoofbeats faded, Tina stepped forward. "They will bring more, maybe a dozen." Reed nodded, his eyes cold as steel. "Then we turned this place into a fortress." That afternoon, the 2 of them got to work. Reed stacked sandbags along the windows, reinforced every board on the gate. Tina pulled dry hay away from the house, cleared an escape path out back, and dug spike traps along the fence. Her muscles flexed under the sun, sweat soaking her back, but her face remained fiercely determined. As night fell, the lantern cast their shadows across the wooden walls. Reed cleaned his guns. T sharpened her spear. The rhythm of steel and stone were together like a battle hymn before war. In the silence, Reed spoke. "You can leave if you want. When they come back, it will be blood and fire." Tina looked up, her eyes blazing. "I've run enough. This is the first time someone has stood beside me. I'm not leaving again." Reed looked at her and something stirred in his chest. Something warm. Not just duty, but trust. This ranch, this land, and this woman, they were now things he would defend at all costs. The night was pitch black, thick clouds swallowing the moon. Wind howled over the roof tiles and the creaking door sounded like a warning. Reed had just dozed off after a long day, fortifying the ranch when the old dog began to bark. Not the usual bark for strangers, but something strange, almost mournful. He bolted upright, a sharp instinct rising in his chest. Stepping into the yard, he saw T, tall, strong, her muscles defined beneath the dim lantern light. She was tying her bag tight to her back, walking barefoot and silently toward the back gate. "Stop!" Reed's voice rang out, sharp and commanding like a soldier giving orders. Takina froze, her shoulders tensed. Then she turned, eyes gleaming with tears. "If I stay, you will lose everything. The ranch, the land, maybe even your life." Reed stepped forward, boots splashing into a puddle left by the evening rain. "You think I would let you walk back to those hunting dogs? You think I would watch them drag you off like some piece of cargo?" Tina's voice cracked as she gripped her spear. "You do not understand. Since the day I was taken, my blood has cursed everyone around me. If I leave, you will be safe." Reed moved in close, nearly shouting, his voice raw with fury and pain. "Safe for what? To sit in this house alone, empty. I would rather lose everything, this ranch, this land, than lose you again." Rain broke loose from the heavens, sudden and furious. Takina stood frozen, her fierce eyes softening, trembling. Rain streamed down her bronze face, mixing with a rare tear. She let the bag fall. It hit the mud with a heavy thud. Why? Why did you choose me? I am abandoned. Marked with shame, Reed did not answer right away. He set his rifle down, then stepped forward, taking her shoulders in his callous hands. Because for the first time in years, when I looked at you, I did not feel alone anymore. Tina's breath caught, her chest rising and falling. Her large hands gripped his coat tightly. They stood like that in the rain, their breaths mingling. Then, without another word, Reed pulled her into his arms. The embrace was fierce, like both were afraid the other might vanish in the next breath. In the darkness and screaming storm, the promise was not spoken aloud. It was made in the way they held each other, desperate and unshakable. They would face the dawn together, no matter how many came for them. At dawn, the sky burned red, as if warning of something ominous. Reed stood on the porch, Winchester fully loaded, eyes locked on the dusty road. Beside him, Takina gripped her spear, her bare shoulders slick with dew, muscles taut with anticipation. The old dog growled, fur bristling, hoof-beats thundered like rolling storm clouds from the swirling red dust. Not 5, but more than a dozen riders emerged. They lined up, rifles glinting under the morning Sunday. The bearded man from the day before smirked. We told you we would come back now. Hand her over or you both die here. Reed stepped down the porch steps, his voice low and steady. You will only take her when I fall. The man signaled with a flick of his hand. Gunfire exploded. Window glass shattered. Splinters flew. The dog lunged forward, barking furiously. Reed dropped behind the fence and fired back. One rider tumbled from his horse, blood staining the red dust. Tina did not retreat. She charged, spear swinging hard, slamming one man down as he tried to climb the fence. She tore the rifle from his hands, fell back behind the sandbags, and fired, each bullet stopping those who dared come close. Gum smoke clouded the air. Screams hoofbeat its chaos. A bullet grazed Reed's shoulder. Blood poured, but he did not flinch. Every shot he took, he made count. One by one, they dropped into the dust. As the raiders finally panicked and pulled back, the bearded man fired one last desperate shot. But Takina was already there, standing on the porch, eyes blazing. She hurled her spear. Its iron tip struck his gun, sending it flying. He screamed and rode off after the others. The smoke began to clear. All that remained was the pounding of hearts and the sharp stench of gunpowder. Reed leaned on his rifle, breathing hard. Tina stepped to him, her strong hand gripping his shoulder, her gaze full of quiet fire. They are gone, she said. We are still here. Reed gave a faint smile. Blood still trickled down, but his eyes held something rare. Peace. Not just still here. We held our ground. They sat on the porch steps, exhausted, yet still holding each other. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the smoke, lighting the wooden roof, shining down on two people who had once been alone and were now bound together. The ranch was no longer just Reed's. It was their fortress now, a place they had chosen to defend, to live in, and to love. That evening, Reed leaned against the porch, shoulder bandaged. Takina resting beside him, her wild black hair dancing in the breeze. Before them, the open prairie stretched in calm silence. And in that stillness, something certain echoed. They had found home. My friends, bullets and guns may win you land, but only love and kindness can hold a home together. When a man chooses to stay and a woman chooses to stand beside him, they are not just fighting the storms outside. They are silencing the storm of loneliness within. That is the greatest victory of all.